who I've had the pleasure of working with on this really interesting project. You know, I had a clinical background, but as a GP, you don't get much involved in transplant planning or transplant coordination. So it was a bit of an eye-opener about, you know, where things are in this world. So Wouter's going to tell us about their experience with openEHR.
Sure. So Wouter Zanen, I've been working at Eurotransplant for 15 years, and I'm a clinical informatician. It's a background. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the models, a little bit of a different view on why we're using openEHR at Eurotransplant at the moment. Eurotransplant is basically quite a small company. We're about 100 people in size, 70 full-time equivalents. And we're in the business of allocating donor organs in 8 countries. Thomas was ahead of himself with 12, a bit, in 8 countries in Europe. And we have a small IT department, about, I think 20 to 25% of our budget goes to IT at Eurotransplant. And we used to build all our applications ourselves, so this is a different approach for us. Let me just first talk you through Eurotransplant a little bit. It's been around since 1967, founded by Professor John van Rood, who sadly died this year, and was founded as an international corporation in allocation. Mr. John van Rood found out that in some research that if you transplant patients, and in this case it was his own skin, this is one of the samples, they were transplanting skin grafts from one researcher to another to see what happens. You could see that some grafts were really good and others were reddish and not so good. And then they were thinking about how does this happen and what is behind that. And they found out the principle of human leukocyte antigens, and at that point they thought, okay, now we have transplant around, heart transplant, kidney transplants were being done in that area of time. They started late 50s to do some transplants here and there, and they felt, oh, this might have a big impact on that. And when they found out it did, they founded Eurotransplant as an international corporation, Netherlands, Belgium, and followed by Austria, Germany, Switzerland, which sadly left. But it was an international corporation from the start, and it still is. We've added a lot of other countries. And we're now the largest organ exchange organization in Europe, with 135 million people living in this area. Of course, not everybody gets transplanted. UK is actually the second largest, so, and I saw some people from Scandinavia, they're a little bit smaller, but they're also an international organization. But actually, we do this area, but we still cooperate a lot with our neighbors on transplantation. So a lot of the same developments are going on in that area, the same things we are doing, and we're actually not sharing our systems or our data or any of those things in a semantically comparable way. And this has a lot of troubles. So we're trying to break open that market a bit. A little bit more about Eurotransplant. There's about 80 transplant centers in the Eurotransplant areas, university hospitals, with a transplantation program in place, and they are divided by organs here. And we do, well, at the moment there's roughly 15,000 active patients on the waiting list, but we have about 250,000 patients that might come back at any time. You know, they can come back for a new transplant in 5 years, 10 years, maybe 30 years even, and we still need the data from that first transplant that happened. And we have about 7,000 organ transplants a year. And that varies a little bit per year, but not a lot. So that's Eurotransplant. So where's IT coming in? Well, Eurotransplant is a very heavy IT organization. We have a system now in place that has been there for 21 years now. So 1996, and that was a system that was distributed to all the centers. We went quickly with modems and installing modems ourselves at the centers. So we installed the modems to connect to our cities. Now, of course, we went to the internet in the same time, but it's an old and it's a legacy system, and we're replacing that. And it has to do this system, when we get a donor in, we need the data from the donor. We have recipient data, that's a waiting list of patients. with recipient data, and we'll combine them in our data storage, and then we'll create a match. And we're at the moment replacing this whole piece, and we've called that our core application, which is it. So a bit about the architecture. So small technical things. At the moment, we have a waiting list application, a donor application, match, which is not run here, and an allocation application. The allocation application is a process-oriented application that just guards the process of allocating organs. So when the donor organ comes in, we have to go step by step through the list of the patients who are listed the highest, get the first offer, and then we go down the list. And this process is guarded in the allocation application. The donor and the waiting list is just, what I would call a clinical data store with all the data of that patient in there, coming from various systems inside those countries. So they can come from the hospital systems, but they also come from transplant coordinators on the road having a laptop and just typing in the data that they just got from the donor hospital in those areas. At the moment, the data is very siloed. So we have waiting list data for kidney transplant patients, we have waiting list data for heart transplant patients, we have waiting list data again for heart transplant patients, that should have been liver or lung or any other organ, and we have data on the donor. They are all siloed, and they're all semantically a little bit different. So we have creatinine in a little bit of a different way, creatinine values, or we have even smaller things like weight or height might be a little bit differently defined in the different areas. And that gives problems when you want to research the data later on. So we put all the data in a data warehouse for analytics and research. So now, we use Oracle at the moment as our middleware and database, and we feel a little bit of lock in there as well. So that's another issue. So we set up and we said we were going to do this a bit different approach. We thought we have to get rid of those silos, and we have to start creating some things that are more open. As we are a network organization, so we're in 8 countries, one of the first things we said, okay, we need some service bus. So we need services that also systems from the different countries, from the different hospitals can use to connect to our services. This need is obvious. We actually see a lot of hospitals having Excel sheets or their own applications. There's even application development from physicians that just develop their own application because they have a need to, and they would like to connect. But they're all, of course, differently, semantically, different standards used. So it's been a real challenge. We made a small business rule on there to do some difficult to do validations, some calculations, and these kind of things. And then we built openEHR models on top of the ThinkEHR system that we get from Amrand. At this moment, we are actually thinking about the BPM, so the process engine, and activity, adaptive case management. So that's what Thomas was talking about. You know, you can adapt which way you're going. We already thought we were going to do that on top of the Oracle middleware, but we're still, well, I'm very interested to hear what Thomas has to say this afternoon about task planning, and maybe we're still moving in that way. And then there's still a need for us to get the data out and to the analytics system, and we're using them around big data, which was before called data extraction service. For that, to get it out as an SQL, just as a how do you call that, a relational database instead of the normal database. That works fairly well. Did I miss any points here? No, I don't think so. So yeah, the choice for openEHR was actually, well, the first thing I want to say, and I didn't put it on the slide here, it was silly not to choose openEHR as our background. We needed something that was sitting in the system, not a message standard, because the message standard is not going to work over multiple countries. It just isn't. There is implementation guides for every country, for every city. Even if you choose something like HL7 version 2 or HL7 Fire, you have local implementation of how you do that. So not having a semantical database that we can use would have been silly for us. But there's some other things that we really needed to do here. We need to have interoperability at some point, and we needed to untangle this process data that we have from the clinical data, so that we have processes for a heart or a lung that can be different for different countries, different systems, but still have the clinical data at the bottom and make that work. Then we needed to care about semantics a lot more than we do in the current system. So we want to have one place where we store this creatinine value, and that should be the only place where it's stored. Same semantics for all these things, even if there's different needs. And then we have to use more classifications. And well, this is still a part where not everything has been solved. But at least we can use classifications, and we can use some mapping tools on top of that to get it into a certain classification. Then the other thing is we needed flexibility. Transplant data in our area doesn't really differ a lot per country. Even the transplant practice in general doesn't really differ. There's international standards of how you do transplant, but the processes around it with patients, with how you set up your centers is different per center. And the governance as well is different per country, which means that the processes should have a lot of flexibility, and also the model should have flexibility. So we could have a big model and just say, okay, for Germany we use this part of the model, for the Netherlands we use this part of the model, but it's stored in the same way. And of course, no vendor lock-in. That was a big reason why we choose this. So the implementation, yeah, we started, well, 10 months ago. I think, just somewhere end of January. We just signed the contract in the end of last year with Marant, but we had some other partners. Accuray, who was doing the project management, and they supplied the first modeling support, just somebody to sit with us and get us through the project, get us started. And we used openEHR with Ian and Hildy, who helped us with training and reviews, and they're still performing reviews every certain now and then on our models. We had a small team, 2 developers for the service bus part, where you put everything on our Oracle service bus, and 1.5 modeler on the clinical data. And we've seen that first the clinical modelers were a little bit behind, but now we tend to have a lot of models ready and not a lot of service bus ready. So we're still thinking about how we have to manage that approach. So the modeling itself, it goes fairly quickly. You can change things quickly, and you add up with an application that actually only needs the connection on top. You know, you have to have the application on top. We have the APIs. Everything is ready. So the modeling, few things. We use the Ocean Informatics template and archetype designer, but we are going to move to the Marant designers, mainly because what we see now is that there's no development in those other designers anymore. And we saw that after 2 months of modeling, being busy modeling, we were actually sufficiently trained to fly solo. We thought that would take us about 4 months or 5 months, but it was actually fairly easy. What does remain valuable, and I think I can stress that enough, is that you have somebody with a lot of experience, like Ian or Hildy or maybe somebody else, look at your models and give you a second opinion. Because every now and then we try to stray from the openEHR path and try to make our own archetype and models, and that, of course, will make it difficult to really get this interoperability. So I wanted to mention that. Yeah, then a big part for us was actually getting the clinicians involved in modeling, and we've set up workshops with clinicians to do that. And that worked quite well. Also, we hope actually that, I didn't put that picture in here right now, but we have a lot of, how you call it, advisory committees. So there's like 10, 12 advisory committees who all have to do work on what is the next medical practice, what is the best scientific way to do things, and then they expect us to implement that yesterday and not today. It's probably always the case. But if you get them involved in modeling, and you can, after the model, you can fairly quickly get a prototype out or get a real, even the real application, that would be the value. Then you've moved this long part of modeling where they're busy actually modeling their own processes and things, and you can move that in. You can get that clinical modeling in those processes. Then the application development after is quite short, and they will be more happy, we hope. I have 2 minutes. Well, I have 2 slides, so 1 slide a minute. That should work. So now after 8 months, and I think that's the thing that we are quite proud of, is that we are actually live with our first project, first pilot center. It's running, and we're expecting actually towards the beginning of next year to go live to about 80 of those transplant centers in our region. For this first thing, we have just 3 templates and a few terminologies inside. I really having the terminology adapter was really helpful. We were really stuck with that before in the old system. Took a long time to change terminologies. This takes, well, just as adapting a CSV file, an Excel file, to change the terminology. So that's really helpful. And we're live, so we're happy. Yeah, well, I have to skip the slides a little bit, but I wanted to give one example of a model. We have this model for the HLA that I was talking about. This is actually where Eurotransplant started, so I thought it was fitting to put it in here. And what you see is that what you usually do is you find the general CKM archetype. So this is a laboratory test, so you have a laboratory test for the CKM, and that provides you with specimen and all these kind of details. And then in test finding here, you have a nice little slot where you can put in your own stuff. Histoimmunogenic typing, which is HLA typing, wasn't an archetype yet, and so we put that in there. The other way to go, and that was the one that I just said, that's a trap where we tried to go into, but we didn't do it in the end, is that you just say, oh, well, I'll remodel everything. So I do my own histoimmunogenic laboratory test, and I do it all myself. And then you miss the interoperability on specimen, on all these things that you're going to need later on when you're trying to set up the connections with the centers. So I'm at my next step slide, so this is good. 1 minute to go. Yeah, so we still, and I hope openEHR, I didn't really see it yet. I hope openEHR is going to do something with that, but we're still looking for stronger business rules and validation and calculation module inside or next to openEHR. We have this HLA, this histoimmunogenic typing, that's certainly going to be on the CKM at some point when we think it's fine, but we also have a need to share all these models with our partners in the different countries to see if they make their own application based on our models, so that we have interoperability there. And there's still a little bit of, okay, can we put these, well, they are not really validated models all already on CKM, or should we put it somewhere else? So this is something that we're still thinking about. Oh, we love if the reference model, because the reference model is very strong in openEHR, but we love it if it would be more exposed, so you can talk to your developer and say, this is here, this is what you have to develop against, and not try to explain over and over that there is a reference model and that you can use those things. And we're interested in task planning. And of course, when we're going to do the connections, Marant has a very lovely API, which we use frequently, but a standardized API would be something I think they're working on as well in openEHR. Then I had some takeaways. Well, I think I've said this already. Our model is really like openEHR because of its flexibility, because they can quickly do things in there. But if you do it, get some experts on board. That will really help. And we're excited about all the improvements that are coming up. Yeah, thank you very much. Did I get it in 2 minutes?
Okay, thank you. I think we will need to move on smartly because we're at a few short presentations, but time for one question if there's anything for Wouter just now. Hopefully we have time for more at the end. Okay,